The heavy, viscous glug of concentrated industrial hydrogen peroxide pouring into the pressurized canister was the only sound in the basement. It hit the bottom of the stainless steel tank with a hollow, rhythmic thud. I kept my eyes fixed on the measuring lines. Exact ratios, a fraction of an ounce too little, and the enzymatic breakdown of organic tissue would stall. A fraction too much, and the chemical reaction would scorch the imported hardwood floors my employers favored. The air in my subterranean garage tasted of ozone, raw chlorine, and the faint, permanent memory of ammonia. My pager vibrated against the heavy canvas belt of my work trousers. The sudden, violent buzz rattled my spine. I set the heavy plastic jug down on the steel workbench. I wiped my hands on a sterile surgical towel before pulling the device from its holster. The small green LCD screen glowed harshly in the dim light. A single address in Tribeca, a penthouse on Northmoor Street, followed by the number 4. 4 meant a priority alpha containment, a high-value target, a massive arterial spray, a narrative that needed to be completely erased before the morning sanitation crews began their routes. I tossed the towel into the incinerator chute. I zipped my heavy black canvas equipment bag. It weighed exactly 42 pounds. I carried it to the rear of my unmarked, charcoal-grey utility van. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, sealing the quiet interior. The drive from Queens to Lower Manhattan was a masterclass in urban isolation. The digital clock on the dashboard read high, muy bon âme. Freezing rain lashed against the reinforced windshield, a chaotic, drumming tempo that drowned out the hum of the heavy FTAM engine. The city outside was a blurred, weeping canvas of distorted neon and black asphalt. I kept the heater turned off. The freezing air circulating through the cabin was necessary. It kept the pulse flat. It kept the mind locked in a state of absolute, geometric precision. I bypassed the main avenues, navigating the labyrinth of service streets and alleyways, bringing the heavy van to a silent stop in the loading dock of a luxury high-rise on Northmoor. The security cameras in the subterranean by were already angled upward, staring blindly at the concrete ceiling. The Russo family had efficient advance teams. I stepped out into the freezing dampness. I slung the heavy equipment bag over my shoulder. The service elevator was waiting, its doors propped open by a wooden wedge. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the penthouse. The ascent was silent, smooth, tearing me away from the bedrock of the city and lifting me into the rarefied air where the apex predators conducted their business. The heavy steel doors slid open. The penthouse was a sprawling expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass, exposed steel beams, and Brazilian cherry hardwood. The Manhattan skyline loomed beyond the rain-slicked windows, a jagged wall of grey shadows and distant, flickering lights. The temperature in the room was stiflingly hot, the thermostat pushed to its absolute limit. And then the smell hit me. It was a suffocating, layered atmosphere. The top note was the heavy, sweet, intoxicating aroma of a lit Cohiba cigar. Beneath the expensive tobacco was the sharp, aggressive bite of top-shelf Kentucky bourbon, but forming the dense, inescapable foundation of the air was the thick, metallic stench of raw, oxidized copper. Mickey Doyle stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the storm. He wore a tailored midnight blue suit, the jacket unbuttoned, revealing the dark leather of his shoulder holster. He was a man built like a heavy-duty vault door, possessing a violent, kinetic energy that vibrated even when he was completely still. He rolled the thick cigar between his teeth, exhaling a dense plume of blue smoke that drifted toward the ceiling. "You took the Midtown Tunnel," Mickey stated, not turning around. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that scraped against the quiet of the penthouse. "The Brooklyn Bridge is under construction," I replied, setting the 42-pound canvas bag onto the pristine kitchen island. The heavy nylon made a soft, synthetic screech against the imported marble. The detour would have cost an additional 4 minutes. Mickey turned slowly. The tip of his cigar glowed a violent orange. His eyes were cold, scanning my face, searching for the micro-expressions that men in my profession were paid to eliminate. He found nothing. I was a blank slate. "The old man is displeased, Silas," Mickey murmured, walking toward the center of the living room. He gave a directive, a simple relocation of assets, but the asset proved uncooperative. The situation required an immediate physical correction. The narrative of the correction is outside my operational parameters, I stated, unzipping the heavy canvas bag. I deal in the aftermath. Show me the radius. Mickey smirked, a cruel, asymmetrical stretching of his lips. He pointed with the glowing end of his cigar toward the massive, sunken living area. The expensive Brazilian cherry hardwood was completely ruined. A massive, jagged pool of dark crimson stretched across the planks, expanding outward from the center of a heavy, translucent plastic painter's tarp that had been hastily thrown over a crumpled shape on the floor. The blood had begun to coagulate at the edges, turning a deep, sticky black in the dim, ambient light. I stepped down into the sunken living room. My heavy rubber-soled boots made absolutely no sound. I stopped exactly 2 feet from the edge of the expanding pool. I analyzed the geometry of the carnage. High velocity, I observed, tracing the fine, mist-like spatter pattern reaching all the way to the base of the expensive leather sectional. Suppressed weapon, steel blank range. The primary arterial breach occurred while the target was standing, judging by the downward trajectory of the cast-off on the far wall. She was a runner, Mickey said, taking a slow sip from a crystal tumbler resting on a side table. The ice clinked sharply. She thought she could outmaneuver the ledger. She thought stealing from Don Alaric was a student loan she didn't have to pay back. I did not process the gender. I did not process the crime. The target was simply biological waste that needed to be dissolved, scrubbed, and erased. The extraction requires heavy plastic and industrial solvents, I said, turning my back on the tarp to face Mickey. The hardwood will need to be entirely removed and incinerated. The blood has seeped into the subfloor. I need 3 hours, and I need the room completely empty. Mickey chuckled, a dry, rattling sound deep in his chest. He drained the bourbon, the amber liquid vanishing down his throat. He set the empty crystal tumbler on the glass table. Take your time, Silas. Make her a ghost. The old man wants this apartment ready for a new tenant by Monday. Mickey buttoned his suit jacket. He walked past me, the smell of his heavy cologne and the burnt tobacco briefly overpowering the stench of the copper. He did not look at the tarp again. He stepped into the service elevator. The steel doors slid shut with a heavy, definitive clank. I was alone. I walked back to my equipment bag. I moved with the precise, choreographed routine I had perfected over 2 decades. I pulled out a heavy, white Tyvek hazmat suit. I stepped into the legs, pulling the synthetic material up over my shoulders, sealing the zipper tightly up to my throat. I snapped a pair of thick, blue nitrile gloves over my hands, ensuring the cuffs were entirely sealed over the sleeves of the suit. Finally, I strapped a heavy industrial half-face respirator over my mouth and nose. The world instantly narrowed. The ambient sound of the rain was muffled by the thick carbon filters. Every breath I took was a loud, mechanical hiss. Inhale. Exhale. The scent of the cigar smoke and the blood was completely eradicated, replaced by the sterile, synthetic smell of the purified air. I picked up the pressurized canister of enzymatic solvent and a heavy, steel scraper. I approached the tarp. The plastic was thick, opaque, obscuring the details of the biological mass beneath it. The pool of blood surrounding it was extensive. Whoever pulled the trigger had severed the carotid artery and simply watched the victim bleed out on the imported wood. I knelt at the edge of the blood pool. The joints in my knees popped in the quiet room. I set the canister down. I reached out with my gloved hand and gripped the edge of the plastic tarp. I needed to assess the structural integrity of the remains before I applied the chemical breakdown agent. I pulled the heavy plastic back. The movement displaced the stagnant air beneath the tarp, sending a localized, concentrated gust of scent upward. The carbon filters of my respirator were industrial grade, designed to block the heaviest biohazards. But they were not designed to block memories. A microscopic phantom slipped through the filters. Turpentine. And lavender. The muscles in my neck locked with such sudden, violent force that the vertebrae at the base of my skull ground together. The mechanical hiss of my breathing abruptly stopped. The air trapped in my lungs turned to solid lead. I stared at the exposed section of the body. It was a hand. A small, delicate hand resting palm up on the ruined hardwood. The fingers were curled slightly inward, relaxed in the absolute finality of death. The fingernails were painted a matte black. The polish was heavily chipped, and trapped in the cuticles, staining the pale skin around the nail beds, were deep, permanent smudges of cobalt blue oil paint. The heavy, suffocating heat of the penthouse instantly vanished, replaced by an Arctic wind that blew directly through the heavy Tyvek suit, freezing the blood in my veins. I did not pull the tarp back further. I did not need to see the face. I did not need to see the entry wound. My eyes dropped to the wrist attached to that hand. Encircling the pale skin, cutting into the flesh slightly due to the pooling of lividity, was a thin, braided leather cord. Attached to the cord was a small, imperfectly cast silver charm. A sparrow. The left wing of the sparrow was slightly shorter than the right. The beak was blunt. It was an amateur piece of metalwork. I knew the exact weight of that silver sparrow. I knew the exact temperature of the forge when the metal was poured. 14 years ago, in a damp, freezing garage in Queens, I had held a small, trembling hand, guiding a pair of heavy tongs to pour molten silver into a clay mold. "It's not perfect, Dad," a high, melodic voice had said, staring at the blunt beak. "It doesn't have to be perfect, Lily," I had replied, wiping a smudge of soot from her cheek. "It just has to be yours." My vision tunneled until the only object existing in the entire universe was the silver sparrow resting in a pool of coagulated blood. The physical reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. A high-pitched, agonizing ringing pierced my eardrums, completely drowning out the mechanical hum of my respirator. The heavy steel scraper slipped from my fingers, clattering loudly against the Brazilian cherry hardwood. The sound was deafening, a gunshot in the silent room. I collapsed forward, my gloved hands slamming onto the floor, splashing into the thick, dark pool. The blood soaked into the blue nitrile, warm and viscous. I stared at the cobalt blue paint on the cuticles. She thought stealing from Don Alaric was a student loan she didn't have to pay back. Mickey's words echoed in the cavernous, empty vault of my skull. Lily was supposed to be in Florence. She was supposed to be studying Renaissance art at the Accademia. I had paid the tuition. I had wired the money. I had built a massive, impenetrable wall of blood and bleach to ensure she never ever touched the world I inhabited. I had spent my entire life erasing the monsters, and now the monster had summoned me to erase my own daughter. I knelt in the blood. My chest heaved violently against the restrictive straps of the respirator, gasping for air that felt like broken glass. I did not reach out to touch her hand. I did not pull the tarp away to see the face of the child I had sworn to protect. If I touched her, the ghost would die. If I pulled the tarp back, the father would scream, and the screaming would never, ever stop. I slowly raised my head, looking at the dark. Rain-streaked windows reflecting the solitary, white-suited figure kneeling in the slaughterhouse. The forensic cleaner was gone. The man sitting in the blood was a hollow, echoing shell, waiting for the fuse to burn down to the detonator. The mechanical hiss of the respirator was the only rhythm left in the world. It regulated the expansion and contraction of my lungs, forcing the oxygen through the carbon filters, keeping the biological machine functioning when the cognitive architecture had completely collapsed. The heavy, dark pool of blood had soaked entirely through the knees of my Tyvek suit, the liquid warmth transferring to my own skin. My gloved hands remained pressed flat against the Brazilian cherry hardwood, inches from the cobalt blue paint smeared on her cuticles. I did not blink. The moisture in my eyes evaporated behind the plastic goggles. The silver sparrow on her wrist caught the weak, ambient light of the Manhattan skyline. If I allowed the muscles in my jaw to relax, the jaw would open. If the jaw opened, the vocal cords would engage, and the sound that tore through the filters would bring Mickey Doyle and the Russo enforcers back up the elevator shaft. A forensic cleaner who compromises the sterility of a crime scene with a personal connection is an immediate liability. In the ecosystem of Don Alaric, liabilities are dissolved in the exact same chemical baths I was currently holding. I locked my triceps. I pushed my body weight upward. The knee joints of the hazmat suit peeled away from the coagulated pool with a thick, wet tearing sound. I stood perfectly vertical. I did not look at the face hidden beneath the heavy painter's tarp. I forced my vision into a rigid, narrow tunnel, focusing exclusively on the geometric coordinates of the room. The blood spatter on the drywall, the pooling on the floorboards, the trajectory of the biological matter. I walked backward, retreating to the heavy canvas equipment bag resting on the kitchen island. The marble was freezing beneath my fingertips. I unzipped the secondary compartment and withdrew the heavy-duty, double-layered vinyl body bag. It was completely opaque, designed to absorb the weight and the shape of the cargo, turning a human being into a shapeless, anonymous cylinder of black plastic. I carried the vinyl bag to the edge of the sunken living room. I unrolled it precisely alongside the tarp. The heavy brass zipper teeth clicked against the floorboards. I knelt again. My pulse was a flat, heavy thud against my ribs, artificially suppressed by the sheer, crushing force of my own psychological quarantine. I reached out and grabbed the edges of the translucent plastic tarp, rolling the material inward, cocooning the body tightly within its own blood to prevent further contamination of the environment. I did not look at the head. I did not look at the torso. I focused entirely on the black canvas of her boots. I slid my forearms under the rolled tarp, anchoring my grip beneath the knees and the shoulder blades. The physical weight of the mass was a violent shock. She was light. She had always been light. The gravity of death magnified the frailty of the structure. I hoisted the tarp and transferred the cargo into the open cavity of the black vinyl bag. As the body settled into the vinyl, the tarp shifted. A heavy, metallic clatter echoed sharply in the quiet room. An object had dislodged from the pocket of her dark denim jacket and fallen onto the hardwood, rolling just outside the perimeter of the vinyl bag. I froze. I aimed the beam of my tactical penlight at the floor. Resting in the smears of dried blood was a heavy brass key. The metal was heavily oxidized, carrying the distinct, deep grooves of a high-security lockbox. Stamped into the square head of the key was a sequence of alphanumeric characters. GCT Bongin Lamwe Hai, Grand Central Terminal, Locker Bongin Lamwe Hai. I picked up the key. The brass was ice-cold, cutting through the thick nitrile of my glove. The edges were sharp. The Russo family did not use public transit lockers for their logistics. They used private vaults, shell company warehouses, and the trunks of impounded vehicles. A Grand Central locker was the desperate, paranoid contingency plan of a solitary operative, a civilian trying to hide an asset. I slipped the brass key deep into the internal pocket of my work trousers, sealing it beneath the Tyvek layer. I reached for the heavy brass zipper of the body bag. I engaged the track at the base of the boots. I pulled the zipper upward, sealing the darkness around the tarp, around the silver sparrow, around the smell of turpentine. The teeth interlocked with a definitive, aggressive rip, closing the vault. I stood up and approached the chemical canisters. The father was sealed inside the black vinyl bag. Only the ghost remained in the penthouse. I initiated the enzymatic breakdown protocol. I mixed the heavy industrial bleach with the hydrogen peroxide, dialing the concentration to maximum lethality. I sprayed the foaming chemical compound across the saturated Brazilian cherry hardwood. The reaction was instantaneous. The dark crimson pool began to boil, a violent, bubbling hiss that sounded like static electricity tearing through the air. The pink foam expanded, devouring the biological signature, breaking down the hemoglobin at a molecular level. I moved to the walls. I utilized the heavy steel scraper and the concentrated solvents, systematically eradicating the fine mist of arterial spray from the pristine white drywall. I worked with the terrifying, tireless rhythm of a machine. My arms moved in precise, overlapping circles. The muscles in my back burned, flooded with lactic acid, but I did not stop. I scrubbed the copper out of the atmosphere. I scrubbed the violence out of the architecture. For 3 hours, the penthouse was a symphony of chemical destruction. The rain against the glass slowed to a miserable, freezing drizzle, revealing the grey, bruised light of the Manhattan dawn bleeding over the East River. I deactivated the halogen work light. The living room was completely sterile. The section of the hardwood where the blood had pooled was heavily bleached, the rich cherry color stripped away, leaving a pale, raw scar on the floorboards. The air smelled exclusively of toxic chlorine and sterilized dust. The narrative of the murder was completely erased. I hauled the heavy black vinyl bag over my shoulder. The dead weight crushed the cartilage in my collarbone. I carried the cargo out to the service elevator, bypassing the security cameras in the subterranean loading bay, and loaded the bag into the reinforced rear compartment of my unmarked utility van. The heavy steel doors slammed shut. I stripped off the Tyvek suit, sealing it inside a red biohazard bag along with my gloves and the respirator filters. I tossed the biohazard bag into the incinerator chute built into the rear of the van. I was left wearing my heavy canvas trousers and a dark grey thermal shirt. My skin was coated in a thin layer of freezing sweat. I climbed into the driver's seat. I keyed the ignition. The heavy FTARM engine roared to life. I shifted into gear and drove out of the loading dock, merging onto the desolate, rain-slicked avenues of the waking city. The drive to my primary facility in Queens was a descent into an absolute, suffocating void. The digital clock on the dashboard read numb. Bonmihai AM. The van crossed the Queensboro Bridge, the steel grate humming violently beneath the heavy tires. The heater was off. The cold seeped through the floorboards, biting into the soles of my boots. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I did not acknowledge the heavy steel partition separating the cabin from the rear compartment. The facility was located in an industrial park in Astoria, masquerading as a legitimate chemical supply warehouse. I pulled the van into the cavernous interior bay. The heavy corrugated steel door rolled down behind me, sealing the space in absolute darkness, save for the flickering fluorescent tubes overhead. The air in the warehouse was freezing, dominated by the overwhelming hum of massive commercial refrigeration units. I backed the van up to the primary loading ramp. I unlocked the rear compartment. I dragged the black vinyl bag out onto the concrete floor. The friction generated a low, synthetic screech. My protocol dictated immediate incineration of priority alpha, biological waste. The massive industrial furnace at the back of the warehouse was already idling, radiating a dull, heavy heat that warped the air around its steel doors. I had burned hundreds of anonymous masses in that furnace, men who had crossed Don Alaric, men who had talked to the federal government, men whose names I never knew and never asked. I stood over the black bag. The brass zipper was exactly where I had left it. I did not move toward the furnace. I reached down and grabbed the canvas straps. I dragged the bag away from the heat, pulling it toward the heavy, insulated steel door of the commercial walk-in freezer. I punched the alphanumeric code into the keypad. The heavy latch disengaged with a solid thunk. I hauled the bag inside the freezer. The temperature was precisely -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The moisture in my breath crystallized instantly, forming thick white plumes in the sterile air. I laid the bag gently on the stainless steel examination table in the center of the frost-covered room. I stood in the freezing silence. The compressor kicked in, a loud, aggressive vibration that shook the metal walls. I placed my bare hand flat against the cold, opaque vinyl. I did not unzip it. I did not look at the turpentine on the fingernails. I secured the lock on the freezer door from the outside, turning the heavy steel wheel until it sealed hermetically. The cargo was preserved. The timeline was frozen. I walked back to the utility van. I retrieved the heavy brass key from the pocket of my discarded work trousers. GCT Born Yinle Muihai. The metal was still cold. The subway ride back to Manhattan was a blur of screeching steel and flickering subterranean lights. I stood in the corner of the crowded car, surrounded by the morning commuters. They smelled of cheap coffee, damp wool, and exhaustion. They looked at the dark circles under my eyes, the heavy canvas trousers, and they looked away. I was a ghost occupying the negative space of their world. Grand Central Terminal was a cathedral of chaotic, kinetic energy. The massive arched windows filtered the grey morning light, illuminating the swirling dust motes dancing above the information booth. The ambient roar of thousands of footsteps echoing against the marble floors was deafening. I moved through the concourse with the invisible, fluid grace of a predator navigating a herd. I located the bank of high-security rental lockers tucked away in a sterile, brightly lit corridor near the lower concourse. The brass plates on the steel doors were worn smooth by decades of transient traffic. I walked down the row. 4.010, 4.011, 4.012. I inserted the heavy brass key. The tumblers aligned with a sharp, mechanical click. I pulled the heavy steel door open. Resting in the empty metal cavity was a single object. A heavy, worn leather satchel. It smelled faintly of old paper and leather conditioner. I pulled the satchel out. I closed the locker door and walked out of the terminal, blending back into the relentless flow of the city. I did not return to the Queen's warehouse. I took a cab to a secondary safe house I maintained in Hell's Kitchen, a windowless, soundproofed basement apartment registered to a deceased alias. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and dried concrete. I dropped the leather satchel onto a cheap laminate table in the center of the room. I engaged the heavy deadbolts on the reinforced steel door. I turned on a single, high-intensity desk lamp, angling the beam directly at the worn leather. I unbuckled the brass straps. I pulled the flap back. The interior of the satchel was meticulously organized, a terrifying forensic archive of corruption. I extracted the first item, a thick, tightly bound stack of $100 bills. $10,000. Wrapped in a band from a bank in the Cayman Islands, I pulled out a second stack, a third, a fourth. $50,000 in untraceable offshore currency. I set the cash aside. I reached deeper into the bag. I pulled out a small blue booklet, a passport. The cover was flawless, an immaculate forgery. I opened it. The photograph stared back at me. It was Lily. Her dark hair was cut shorter, framing the sharp angles of her jaw. Her eyes, usually bright and expressive, were flat, carefully schooled into a neutral, unrecognizable expression. The name printed next to the photograph was Elena Rostova. The nationality was Russian. The stamps indicated recent, frequent travel to Geneva and Zurich. The oxygen in the safe house turned to ash. The joints in my fingers locked, refusing the brain's command to close the booklet. A high-frequency vibration settled behind my sternum. My daughter was not a victim of a random mugging. My daughter was not caught in the crossfire of a turf war. My daughter was holding $50,000 in offshore cash and a high-level forged passport. I set the passport down next to the money. I reached into the satchel one final time. I withdrew a heavy, encrypted digital storage drive. It was military-grade, designed to self-destruct if the casing was breached. I booted up an isolated, air-gapped laptop sitting on the table. I inserted the drive. The screen went black for 10 seconds before a password prompt appeared. I stared at the blinking cursor. I thought about the silver sparrow, the blunt beak, the uneven wings. I typed the date we had forged it in the Queen's garage. The drive unlocked. The screen flooded with meticulously categorized folders. I opened the primary directory. It was labeled the Rousseau Portfolio. The files contained hundreds of high-resolution photographs, oil paintings, sculptures, rare antiquities. I recognized the background in the photographs. It was the heavily fortified, climate-controlled vault in the basement of Don Alaric's private estate in the Hamptons, a vault that supposedly held the family's most liquid, untraceable assets. Attached to each photograph was a detailed, highly technical appraisal document. The documents analyzed the brushstrokes, the canvas aging, the chemical composition of the pigments. They authenticated the pieces as masterpieces worth tens of millions of dollars. But below the official appraisals were secondary, hidden files. I opened them. They were purchase orders from black market art forgers in Eastern Europe, receipts for synthetic cobalt blue pigment, chemical formulas for artificially aging canvas using UV light and specialized solvents. The architecture of the entire conspiracy slammed into my mind with the force of a freight train. Don Alaric was not collecting masterpieces. He was running a massive global money laundering operation. He was purchasing cheap forgeries, having them authenticated by an expert, and then selling them to his own offshore shell companies at artificially inflated prices to clean his illicit capital, and the expert authenticating the forgeries. The expert forging the provenance documents and handling the synthetic cobalt blue paint. I looked at the signature on the bottom of the appraisal files. Lily Vance. The vibration behind my sternum expanded, turning into a cold, jagged block of ice that crushed my lungs. Mickey Doyle's words echoed in the basement. She thought stealing from Don Alaric was a student loan she didn't have to pay back. The false trail illuminated itself with blinding, perfectly logical clarity. Lily was not studying in Florence. She was embedded deep inside the Russo family's laundering network. She was the architect of the authentication fraud, the offshore cash, the fake passport, the encrypted drive. She was skimming the profits. She had stolen $50,000 from the transactions, compiled the evidence of the forgery ring to use as blackmail or insurance, and she was preparing to flee the country as Elena Rostova. She was a criminal, a thief who had bitten the hand of an apex predator. Mickey Doyle had not murdered an innocent civilian. Mickey Doyle had executed a rogue operative who was stealing from his don. Mickey had caught her packing her bags in the Tribeca penthouse. He had put a suppressed bullet through her chest, completely unaware that the biological waste he left for the cleaner was the cleaner's own blood. The logic was impenetrable. It was a perfect, airtight narrative. The evidence was irrefutable. My daughter had been corrupted by the very world I had sacrificed my soul to keep her away from. She had chosen the shadows, she had chosen the greed, and she had paid the absolute, terrifying price that the shadows demanded. I sat in the windowless basement, staring at the glowing screen of the laptop. The silence was heavier than the ocean floor. The ghost had protected the father from the grief, but the ghost could not protect the father from the shame. The absolute, crushing devastation of her corruption was a poison that paralyzed every nerve ending in my body. My encrypted pager vibrated on the table, shattering the silence. The screen displayed a single, scrambled text code, a summons. Russo Social Club, Mulberry Street, Mutngin Born Tramhours. Confirmation required. Don Alaric wanted the verbal confirmation that the penthouse was sterile. He wanted to look the cleaner in the eye and verify that the problem had been incinerated. I closed the laptop. I packed the cash, the passport, and the drive back into the leather satchel. I locked the satchel in the floor safe beneath the laminate table. I stood up. I walked to the small bathroom in the corner of the safe house. I turned on the cold water tap. I splashed the freezing water onto my face, scrubbing the exhaustion and the despair from my skin. I stared at the reflection in the cracked mirror. The eyes staring back were completely dead. Two flat, black voids that registered absolutely zero emotion. The ghost was ready. I arrived at the Russo Social Club in Little Italy, exactly at Mutngin Born Tramhours. The air inside the basement establishment was thick, suffocating. The heavy scent of roasted espresso beans and black licorice anise from the sambuca fought against the stale, aggressive odor of imported cigar smoke. The walls were lined with dark mahogany, absorbing the dim light from the stained glass fixtures above the bar. 4 heavily armed enforcers stood near the entrance. They patted me down with brutal efficiency, ignoring the heavy canvas work trousers and the plain grey thermal shirt. They found no weapons. I never carried weapons to a confirmation meeting. The cleaner is neutral ground. I was ushered into the back room. The room was a massive, windowless vault. A heavy oak table dominated the center. Don Alaric Russo sat at the head of the table. He was 65, a man whose sheer physical mass seemed to warp the gravity around him. His face was a landscape of deep, predatory lines. He wore a heavy camel hair cardigan over a silk shirt. He was slowly peeling an orange with a small, pearl-handled pocket knife. The sharp, citrus spray cut through the cigar smoke. Mickey Doyle stood by the Don's right shoulder. Mickey wore the same midnight blue suit he had worn in the penthouse. The heavy leather shoulder holster was clearly visible. He was chewing on a toothpick, his eyes scanning my face with the casual arrogance of a man who held the leash to a very violent dog. "Silas," Don Alaric rasped, not looking up from the orange. His voice was a deep, guttural rumble. "Sit." I pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat opposite the Don. The wood creaked under my weight. I kept my hands resting flat on my thighs. "The penthouse on North Moor," Alaric said, carefully slicing a sliver of the orange peel. "Mickey tells me the asset was messy. A substantial arterial breach. I need the property listed on the market by Monday." "The location is completely sterile, Don Alaric," I stated, my voice a flat, mechanical drone. The pitch was perfect. The cadence was flawless. The biological hazard was contained and transported to the primary facility. The organic material has been incinerated. The hardwood was treated with industrial-grade enzymatic solvents. The blood signature has been eradicated at a molecular level. The apartment smells only of bleach and ozone. Alaric stopped peeling the orange. He looked up. His eyes were cold, calculating. He searched my face for any hesitation, any microscopic tremor of deceit. He found the ghost. "Excellent," Alaric murmured, popping a slice of the orange into his mouth. He chewed slowly. "You are an artist, Silas. The best eraser in the city. The asset was a disappointment. A thief who thought she could manipulate the architecture of my business. She forged the documents. She skimmed the profits. She thought she was untouchable because she was smart. But smart does not stop a hollow point round, does it, Mickey?" "No, boss. It doesn't." Mickey chuckled, the toothpick rolling across his teeth. "She was packing a bag when I walked in. Had a fake passport, offshore cash. I put her down before she could even reach for the zipper. The narrative was perfectly aligned with the evidence in the leather satchel. The false trail was solid concrete. Lily was a thief. Mickey caught her. The Don ordered the cleanup. But as Mickey shifted his weight, leaning against the heavy oak table, the ambient light from the stained glass fixture caught the edge of his left hand. Mickey was not wearing gloves in the penthouse. He had been holding a crystal tumbler of bourbon. I looked at his hand. Trapped deep in the cuticle of his left index finger, barely visible against his tanned skin, was a tiny, microscopic smudge of color. It was not dried blood. It was not cigar ash. It was cobalt blue oil paint, the exact same synthetic pigment that had stained Lily's cuticles. The vibration behind my sternum suddenly stopped. The cold, jagged block of ice in my chest shattered, replaced by a terrifying, white-hot absolute clarity. If Mickey Doyle had simply walked into the penthouse and shot a fleeing thief from across the room, as he had just stated, he would never have touched the synthetic paint. The paint was on Lily's hands because she was the forger. The paint would only transfer to Mickey if there had been a violent, intimate physical struggle, if he had gripped her hands, if he had forced her to do something before he pulled the trigger. But the blood spatter in the penthouse indicated a point-blank execution while the target was standing. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle on the hardwood. The narrative cracked. The logic began to bleed. I looked at the Don. Alaric was casually eating his orange, completely relaxed. He believed Mickey's story. Alaric believed Lily was a thief who was caught fleeing, which meant Mickey had lied to the Don. Mickey didn't catch Lily packing her bags. Mickey didn't shoot her because she was stealing from Alaric. Mickey had the paint on his hands because Mickey was the one handling the forged art. Mickey was the one coordinating the laundering network with Lily. The offshore accounts, the forged passport, they weren't Lily's escape plan. They were Mickey's. Mickey was the one stealing the $20 million from Don Alaric. Lily was just the proxy, the civilian asset he had compromised to authenticate the forgeries. And when Lily realized the magnitude of the theft, when she realized Mickey was going to burn the family and leave her holding the bag, she panicked. She gathered the evidence, the satchel I found in Grand Central, to take to the Don to prove Mickey's treason. Mickey intercepted her at the penthouse. He fought her for the satchel, transferring the wet cobalt paint to his own hands. When he realized she had already hidden the satchel, He put a suppressed round through her chest. He then called the Don, completely controlling the narrative, claiming he had discovered the art appraiser stealing the funds and executed her on the spot. My daughter was not a corrupted criminal. My daughter was a terrified civilian who had tried to expose a traitor, and the traitor had slaughtered her to protect his $20 million theft. The ghost evaporated. The father resurrected, fueled by a violence so absolute it threatened to fracture my spine. I did not look at Mickey's hand again. I kept my eyes fixed on the Don. The incineration was flawless, I said, my voice dropping to a low, barely audible frequency that forced both men to lean in slightly. The ledger is balanced. Go to the bartender on your way out, Alaric commanded, waving the pearl-handled knife dismissively. He has an envelope for you. Take a week off, Silas. The city is quiet. I will, I said. I stood up from the heavy wooden chair. I turned my back on the apex predators. I walked toward the heavy double doors, every muscle in my body coiled with the kinetic energy of a detonating star. The false trail was burned. Mickey Doyle had used my daughter as a shield for his own greed, and he had used my own hands to scrub his crime scene sterile. He thought the evidence was incinerated. He thought the narrative was sealed. He didn't know the body was currently resting in a -4-degree freezer, and he didn't know that the cleaner he had just paid to erase his sins was the father of the ghost who was going to tear his empire apart. The heavy oak doors of the Russo Social Club groaned as I pushed through them, the sound swallowed instantly by the ambient roar of the Mulberry Street crowd. The city was a sprawling, indifferent beast, exhaling a freezing mist that clung to the brickwork like a damp shroud. I walked with the measured, predatory gait of a man who had ceased to exist. I was no longer Silas Vance, the cleaner who erased the sins of the Marcano family. I was an empty suit of clothes draped over a tactical intent, so pure it bordered on the divine. I reached the utility van parked 3 blocks away, the metal of the handle biting into my palm with a numbing, electric chill. I slid inside, the cabin smelling of nothing. I had scrubbed every trace of my own existence from the upholstery. I didn't drive toward Queens. I drove toward the only place in the city where the dead didn't have to keep secrets, the industrial warehouse in Astoria. The facility was a cathedral of absolute zero. I keyed the entry code, the heavy steel roll-up door rattling into the ceiling with a screech that sounded like a dying breath. I pulled the van inside, killed the lights, and stepped out into the biting, chemical-laden air of the warehouse. I walked directly to the commercial walk-in freezer. The hum of the compressor was a low, aggressive growl. I punched in the sequence. The heavy latch disengaged. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I kept the pen light cupped in my palm. The beam cut through the frost, illuminating the stainless steel table in the center of the room. The black vinyl bag sat exactly where I had placed it. I reached for the zipper. The brass teeth were stiff, frozen into place by the extreme cold. I pulled with a calculated, surgical force. The vinyl parted with a sharp, synthetic tear. I didn't look at her face. I looked at the hands. The cold had preserved the biological evidence with frightening clarity. I shone the penlight on the left index finger. The cobalt blue oil paint was still there, embedded in the cuticle, a microscopic smudge of artistic fraud. But I needed more than pigment. I needed the narrative that Mickey Doyle had tried to rewrite. I reached for the inner pocket of the vinyl bag where the entry wound was located. I pulled back the saturated silk of her dress. The wound was a perfect, devastating hole, cauterized by the sheer velocity of the round. I shone the light into the cavity. There was no exit wound. The round hadn't passed through. It was lodged somewhere in the thoracic cavity. I grabbed the heavy-duty medical shears from the supply tray. My hands were entirely steady. I worked with the clinical detachment of a man performing an autopsy on his own soul. I excavated the cavity, the cold, stiff tissue yielding to the steel. After 6 minutes of meticulous, agonizing effort, I found it. I retrieved the lead slug with a pair of long-nosed surgical forceps. I held it under the light. It wasn't a standard .45 caliber hollow point used by Russo's enforcers. It was a fragment of a high-velocity, small-caliber jacketed round, specifically a 5.7 millimeter projectile. The signature of a specialized, suppressed FN-5 Mickey Doyle carried a standard issue, 45 caliber Colt 1911. Everyone in the Rousseau family carried a 45. It was their signature, their pride, their brutal tradition. Mickey Doyle didn't shoot Lily. I stood in the freezing silence of the freezer, the lead slug rolling back and forth in my forceps. The logic cascaded through my mind, overturning the established reality. Mickey lied to the Don about the cleanup. He lied to me about the execution, and he lied to himself about his dominance. But Mickey hadn't pulled that specific trigger. The only person in the city who carried an FN-5, the only person who operated with the surgical, cold-blooded efficiency to plant that slug and stage the penthouse, was Victor Kincaid, the ghost. He hadn't been hired to protect the Rousseau family. He had been hired to audit them into extinction. He was the one who fed the forged documents to the Don. He was the one who orchestrated the struggle, the framing of my daughter, and the execution of the entire Rousseau hierarchy. He didn't just want the territory, he wanted the leverage of a morning cleaner. He wanted me to believe the Rousseau family was responsible, to drive me into a blood-fueled, unthinking massacre against Alaric Rousseau, so that when the commission finally stepped in to clean up the ashes, they would find a cleaner who had turned into a serial killer, a liability to be eliminated by the state. I wasn't just a cog in the machine. I was a structural defect they were trying to grind out of existence. I dropped the forceps into the bin. I zipped the bag. I walked out of the freezer and locked the door, the sound of the latch echoing like a gavel. I climbed back into the van. My burner phone vibrated. Mortngin Sao Trum hours. The Rousseau Social Club. Alaric is hosting a wake for Frankie. The entire leadership will be present. I didn't check the sender. I didn't need to. I pulled a second duffel bag from the storage rack in the back of the warehouse. It wasn't filled with bleach or scrapers. It was filled with the tools of the other trade. I drove back into the city, the rain turning into a heavy, blinding sleet. The streets were empty. The city was holding its breath, waiting for the slaughter. I pulled into a basement garage 3 blocks from the Rousseau Club. I didn't wear the Tyvek suit. I wore a heavy, tactical black wool coat. I holstered the Glock Muichin. I strapped a secondary, compact submachine gun to my waist, concealed by the long hem of my coat. I walked toward the social club. The front entrance was guarded by 4 men, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the street for a ghost that had already arrived. I didn't approach the front. I moved to the fire escape in the alley. I climbed with the silent, fluid grace of a man who was no longer worried about the consequences of his existence. I reached the roof of the club. I found the HVAC intake, the massive, humming fan that serviced the backroom vault. I didn't use a wrench. I used a canister of concentrated, high-density chemical irritant, the same base compound I used to sanitize Frankie's penthouse. I poured the liquid directly into the intake. The HVAC system would vaporize the compound and distribute it into the vault within 30 seconds. It wouldn't kill them. It would blind them, burn their lungs, and turn their internal geography into a panic-stricken hellscape. I climbed down the fire escape, stopping at the window of the backroom vault. I peered through the heavy glass. Don Alaric Rousseau, Mickey Doyle, and the entire leadership of the Rousseau family sat around the oak table, drinking brandy and discussing the success of the cleanup. They were drinking to the death of a girl who only wanted to be an artist. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the remote ignition key I had taken from the van. I pointed it at the master electrical panel of the building, which was exposed on the exterior brick wall. I pressed the button for the emergency circuit breaker. The club plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The screaming began inside the vault. The chemical compound was already taking hold. I smashed the window with the butt of the Glock. I vaulted inside. The air was thick with coughing, retching, and the panicked thrashing of men who had suddenly lost their sight. I didn't speak. I didn't shout. I moved through the darkness, following the sound of the blind, chaotic violence. I didn't need to see. I had cleaned these rooms for 15 years. I knew every inch of this geography. I fired 3 times. 3 suppressed reports that sounded like the snapping of dry twigs. The screaming stopped. I walked to the head of the table. I could hear Alaric Rousseau wheezing, clutching his throat, his lungs burning from the chemical vapor. I stood over him. I turned on my tactical penlight. The light illuminated the vault. Mickey Doyle was sprawled on the floor, 3 holes in his suit, his hand still gripping the pearl-handled knife. Don Alaric looked up at me, his eyes wide, his hands clawing at the table. "Silas," he rasped, the word a wet, bubbling mess. "Why?" "The ledger is closed, Alaric," I whispered. I fired one final shot. The club fell silent. I walked to the center of the room. I retrieved the ledger, the real one, the one Mickey had kept hidden under his seat. I opened it. I didn't look at the money. I looked at the final page. It wasn't a record of assets. It was a list of hits. And at the very bottom, in handwriting that matched the forgery, was one final name I had never seen before: Silas Vance. They had been planning to clean the cleaner from the very beginning. I dropped the ledger onto the pile of bodies. I walked out the back door, into the cold, cleansing rain of a city that had no idea the slate had just been wiped clean. There was no father left. There was no cleaner. There was only the rain, and the absolute terrifying freedom of the void.